Germany, April 1945. The war was already lost, but the streets were still filled with uniforms. Only now those uniforms hung off boys who should have been in school, not in a collapsing army. American troops advancing through ruined towns expected fanatics or last-stand defenders. Instead, they found trembling teenagers, some too small to carry their rifles, stepping out from behind hedges with hands raised. What happened next revealed one of the quietest, saddest truths of the final days of the Third Reich. Fact 1. The moment the war outgrew them. When the 89th Infantry Division entered the German village of Hersching in late March 1945, the first soldiers they saw weren't soldiers at all. They were boys, thin, pale, wearing oversized jackets that smelled of smoke and damp wool. Some were 14, a few even younger. They had been pressed into the Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch militia, created when the regime ran out of real men to fight. These boys had marched out believing the war still had shape and meaning, but as they watched the Americans move through the fields with calm discipline, something inside them collapsed. Many had been told the US Army would torture them, shoot them, or send them to camps. Yet when machine gun fire cracked in the distance, they flinched not from the Americans, but from their own officers, men who warned that surrender was treason, punishable by death. The boys later said they didn't know which side frightened them more. That morning, a group of them stepped into the road as an American jeep approached. They weren't sure what to do with their rifles, so they placed them carefully on the ground, as if returning borrowed tools. One boy tried to salute, another began crying without sound. A sergeant from Iowa, stunned by how young they were, simply motioned for them to sit and gave them water from a canteen. The boys drank with shaking hands. In that moment, they understood something their officers never taught them. Surrender didn't feel like failure. It felt like exhaling for the first time in months. For many, it was the moment the war stopped being a story told to them and became something they were finally allowed to leave behind. Fact 2. The lie they carried to the front. Most of these boys walked into the final weeks of the war carrying more than a rifle. They carried a story, one fed to them since childhood. Their teachers, youth leaders, even their parents whispered it. The Americans will show no mercy. By 1945, Germany's propaganda machine was running on fumes, but its fear campaigns burned stronger than ever. Posters showed American soldiers as giants with empty eyes. Radio broadcasts claimed the front was littered with tortured German prisoners. Some boys were told that if captured, they'd be shot immediately. Others believed their families would be punished if they surrendered. So when the front finally reached their villages, their fear was not of dying in combat. It was fear of the unknown enemy they had been taught to imagine. One 16-year-old later recalled standing in a cellar, clutching his rifle, thinking, "If I run out, they'll kill me. If I stay, my officer will." The collapse of the Reich created absurd little corners of terror like this, a child weighing which adult was more dangerous. Yet when American patrols eventually reached them, the truth shattered the myth instantly. The Americans didn't scream at them. They didn't hit them. They didn't even treat them like soldiers. A medic bandaged a boy's frostbitten fingers. Another GI gave away a chocolate bar that melted almost instantly in a trembling hand. Some of the boys burst into tears, not out of fear, but from the shock of discovering that the world outside Nazi Germany was nothing like the world they had been shown. The lie they carried finally cracked open, and once it did, it never returned. Years later, many said this was the moment they realized the war had been built on stories meant to break children before they ever grew up. Fact 3. The first night in American hands. After surrendering, the boys expected chaos, shouting, punishment, even violence. Instead, the first night was defined by something none of them saw coming: silence. American troops separated them from older prisoners and marched them to makeshift holding areas, barns, empty schoolhouses, abandoned railway sheds. The boys walked stiffly, unsure whether they had actually survived the day or were simply in another stage of danger. But the Americans didn't interrogate them. They didn't force them to kneel. They did something almost disorienting. they fed them. Canned meat, biscuits, watery coffee. For boys who had lived on thin soup and dry bread for months, the food was overwhelming. Some ate too fast and got sick. Others hid portions in their pockets, afraid it wouldn't come again. That night, many couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but because it was the first night without air raid sirens, without officers shouting, without the constant dread of artillery in the distance. An American corporal placed a lantern on a crate and sat guard, flipping through a mail order catalog. One of the boys later said the sight of a man calmly looking at pictures of tractors, shoes, and farm tools felt surreal. It was like discovering another planet. Some boys whispered in the dark, wondering whether their families had survived. Others cried quietly into their sleeves, releasing months of tension. And in that dim, dusty shelter, the truth began to settle. The enemy they had feared most wasn't the one outside. It had been the war itself, an enormous shadow that finally, mercifully, stopped following them. Fact 4. The moment childhood returned. By the second or third day in custody, something unexpected began to happen. The boys, still technically prisoners of war, started acting like children again. American soldiers noticed it. Almost immediately, a few GIs tossed them a deflated soccer ball they found in a barn. The boys patched it with strips of cloth and began kicking it across the field with the frantic joy of kids who had not played in years. Their movements were awkward at first. Months of hunger had stiffened their legs. But soon they were laughing, shouting, arguing over goals. A sergeant from Ohio wrote in a letter that the strangest sight of the entire campaign wasn't the ruins of German cities. It was watching enemy soldiers chase a ball with the same energy as schoolboys released for recess. He said they looked as if the uniforms didn't fit their souls. Some American guards joined in, careful not to make it look like favoritism. Others just watched, trying to reconcile the bitter reality that these were the same enemy troops sent to fight them only days earlier. The boys' faces softened, their shoulders lowered, even their voices changed. They no longer tried to imitate the harsh tone of their officers. And in those small, fragile moments, kicking a patched ball, sharing a piece of bread, arguing over nothing, the war briefly loosened its grip on them. Childhood, stolen too early, edged back into view. For many of the boys, this was the moment they realized they might have a future after all. Not a future as soldiers of a lost cause, but as ordinary boys who had survived something they were never meant to understand. Fact 5. The orders they were too young to understand. Most of the boys who surrendered in 1945 never fully understood the commands they had been given. Their officers spoke in clipped directives: hold the line, defend the bridge, delay the enemy, phrases meant for trained soldiers, not teenagers who barely knew how to load their rifles. Some had been handed Panzerfausts, one-shot anti-tank launchers, without any explanation of how far the blast radius reached. Others were told to fight to the last man, a phrase they repeated without grasping its meaning. One 15-year-old later recalled standing at a crossroads with his squad, staring at a map they couldn't read. Their lieutenant had vanished overnight. The boys waited for hours until they heard approaching vehicles. American jeeps, not German reinforcements. With no adult left to follow, they lowered their weapons. None of them had fired a single shot. American troops were stunned when they interrogated the boys. Many couldn't explain which unit they belonged to. Some didn't know the name of the town they had marched from. A few thought the Americans were British. Their answers revealed the truth. These were not soldiers abandoning a cause. They were children confused by a war that had already outpaced them. In their pockets, the Americans found items that said everything: marbles, a pocket knife, a school notebook with half-finished math problems, a crumpled letter from a mother telling her son to be careful. These small belongings made it painfully clear that they had been pushed into a role the world expected of grown men. And when the war finally ended around them, the boys understood the commands they had followed weren't orders. They were burdens placed on shoulders too young to carry them. Fact 6. The fear of their own countrymen. One of the hardest truths about the teen soldiers of 1945 is that they feared their German superiors more than the advancing Americans. As the Reich disintegrated, discipline collapsed into desperation. SS patrols roamed the countryside, executing anyone they suspected of desertion, sometimes without checking whether the accused was even old enough to shave. Posters nailed to village doors warned that surrender meant betrayal. School teachers lectured students that dying for Germany was better than living in shame. For boys raised in a culture where obedience was sacred, this created an impossible trap. They weren't old enough to understand politics, but they understood consequences. Stories spread quickly. A 17-year-old hanged for trying to go home, a group of schoolboys shot for refusing to carry ammunition, a child labeled a coward because he dropped his rifle during an air raid. These tales traveled faster than official orders and shaped the boys' final days more than any military doctrine. So when American forces approached, the real danger for many wasn't the enemy. It was being seen surrendering by their own side. Some hid their white flags until the very last moment. Others slipped away from their units at dawn, terrified of what their officers might do to them. One American lieutenant wrote in his diary that the boys often looked over their shoulders even after surrendering, as if expecting someone from their own army to drag them back. That reflex, to fear the uniform behind them more than the one ahead, revealed a deeper truth. The Reich had turned on its children long before the Allies entered Germany. And by the time the boys reached American lines, they weren't escaping the enemy. They were escaping the world that made them believe dying was their duty. Fact 7. The shock of ordinary American life. Perhaps the most surprising moment for many German teens came not during surrender, but afterward, when they saw how ordinary American soldiers lived. The GIs carried things the boys had never imagined frontline troops possessing. Chewing gum, comic books, photographs of girlfriends taped inside helmets, small radios playing music. To boys raised in rigid discipline and constant fear, these small glimpses of normal life felt almost unreal. One 17-year-old remembered watching two American soldiers argue about baseball statistics while cleaning their rifles. Another saw a private reading a letter from home and laughing out loud. It was these simple acts, laughing, joking, complaining about food, that shocked the boys far more than American firepower ever had. They had been told the U.S. Army was a brutal machine with no humanity. Instead, they found young men barely older than themselves, men who talked about farms, cars, and plans for after the war. The boys realized something profound. American soldiers could imagine a future. German youth could not. In the final months of the Reich, teenagers were taught only sacrifice, duty, and death. Dreams were discouraged. Futures were whispered about as something selfish or naive. So witnessing Americans behave like ordinary people, even in wartime, shook them to the core. Some said it was the first time they understood that life could be more than uniformed obedience. The moment they saw the enemy smile, joke, or hum a tune from home, they realized how much their world had been narrowed. For the first time, many felt the quiet grief of understanding what childhood was supposed to look like, and what theirs had been turned into. Fact 8. The quiet relief of being treated as children. As the days passed, American troops began to treat the young prisoners not as captured enemies, but as boys who had been caught in something far bigger than themselves. The shift was subtle at first. A blanket draped over small shoulders, a canteen refilled without being asked, a guard speaking slowly so the boys would understand English commands. But soon the tone changed entirely. The Americans stopped calling them troops and started calling them kids. For the boys, this was almost disorienting. In Germany, being called a child was shameful, proof that you hadn't lived up to the nation's expectations. In American custody, it was the opposite. Being recognized as children meant they were allowed to rest, eat, and stop pretending to be warriors. It allowed them, for the first time in months or years, to let their faces soften and their voices rise naturally instead of enforced military confidence. One 14-year-old was so small, his uniform sleeves had been tied with twine to keep them from dragging. An American guard tore an old blanket into strips and wrapped them around the boy's wrists like makeshift cuffs. Another GI found a stack of school books in a farmhouse and tossed them into the holding area. Within hours, the boys were flipping through them, some reading, some just running their fingers over the pages, touching a world they thought they had lost forever. This quiet recognition of their youth didn't erase the trauma, but it gave them a fragile space to breathe. For many, it was the first moment in years they were allowed to simply exist. Not as soldiers, not as symbols of a collapsing nation, but as children. And that small mercy, offered by men who had every reason to hate them, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Fact 9. The letters home. They were afraid to write. After several days in American custody, the boys were offered the chance to write home. For many, this moment was more frightening than surrendering. They didn't know if their families were alive. They didn't know if their villages had been bombed, or if their fathers had returned from the front, or if their mothers would even recognize their handwriting after so many months away. Some hesitated because they feared the letter itself. Proof they had surrendered might bring shame or punishment upon their families in a system that treated capitulation as betrayal. Still, they wrote. On scraps of paper, in shaky script, came the same phrases again and again. "I am alive. I am safe. Do not worry." A few confessed they had surrendered, hoping their parents would understand. Others avoided the subject entirely, pretending they had been captured in some heroic, unavoidable moment, rather than simply laying down their rifles in fear and exhaustion. American soldiers watched them write in silence. One lieutenant later said the boys looked older while writing than when fighting. The act forced them to confront the truth. Everything they had been taught about honor, duty, and sacrifice had led them here, sitting in a barn under guard, praying their mothers would forgive them. And yet, for many, writing home was the first small step back toward the world they had left behind. It was the beginning of reclaiming a life that had been interrupted by a war they never chose. Fact 10. The moment they realized the war was truly over. Even after surrendering, many boys didn't believe the war was truly ending. They expected German counterattacks, SS patrols, or sudden orders to resume fighting. Their bodies were still tense, their minds still wired for alarms, commands, and fear. The moment the war ended for them came in small, almost mundane ways. For some, it was seeing American soldiers stack their weapons neatly in a corner, treating them like objects rather than sacred extensions of duty. For others, it was hearing birds, actual birds, singing in the early morning because there was no artillery to drown them out. One boy later said the turning point came when he watched an American corporal sit down on the grass and eat an apple with both hands, casually, slowly, as if the world had already moved on. Another said he realized it was over when he saw a group of GIs washing their socks in a stream and arguing about whose turn it was to cook. War, he understood, had no place in moments like that. Only then did the tension finally break. Some boys slept for 12 hours straight. Others simply stared at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. The war they had been promised would define their lives had ended far more quietly than they ever imagined. Without glory, without revenge, without speeches, just silence, and the slow return of ordinary life. Fact 11. The weight of being spared. As the days passed, something unexpected took root in many of the boys. Guilt. Being treated kindly by American soldiers did not erase the fact that older German soldiers were still dying on the front. Some of these boys had older brothers still fighting. A few knew their fathers were somewhere in the collapsing lines along the Rhine. They had been taught their entire lives that survival in defeat was shameful. Now, survival itself felt like a burden. A 19-year-old captured near Kassel confessed to an American chaplain that he felt like a coward for living while so many others were dying. The chaplain later wrote that the boy wept as if asking permission to still be alive. The Americans tried to comfort them, But they couldn't undo years of indoctrination with a few gentle words. Still, something began to shift. The boys started to understand that being spared wasn't weakness. It was a chance to rebuild, to learn, to step into a life that the war had nearly stolen from them. The guilt didn't vanish. It would stay with many for decades. But in the quiet moments, sharing food, laughing softly, hearing music from a soldier's radio, they began to accept something they had never been allowed to believe. There was value in simply living. Fact 12. The boys who returned as men. When the boys were finally transferred to larger POW camps, a strange transformation had already begun. They entered captivity as terrified children wearing oversized uniforms, but they left that first period of surrender changed. Not hardened, but opened. They had seen a world beyond propaganda. They had met enemies who treated them with humanity. They had learned, in a way their leaders never intended, that survival could be an act of courage. One American sergeant later said that watching those boys march out of the temporary holding area was like watching fear walk away from itself. The boys moved quietly, but not timidly. They carried no rifles, only blankets and small bundles of belongings. Yet their posture was different, less rigid, less brittle. They walked like people who had started imagining a future. And when many eventually went home months later, they didn't return to the same childhood they had left. They returned as young men who had seen the cost of blind loyalty and the fragility of the world they had been told was unbreakable. Their experiences in those brief days of surrender became a private memory they rarely spoke of, but one that shaped them for the rest of their lives. In the end, these boys were not symbols of a defeated nation. They were reminders of what war steals first: childhood, truth, and the chance to grow up gently. Their surrender wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of becoming human again.